You're listening to The Maastricht Diplomat. Welcome back, everyone, to the 10th and last episode of Understanding Europe Season 1. It most definitely has been a journey. So throughout this season, we have recorded 10 episodes, including this one. And we've covered topics from security, trade, identity. We were all over, and diverse is maybe the best word to describe the topics of the series.
One might say that this season has been united in its diversity, just like the EU.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
You had to, didn't you?
I had to. I couldn't stop myself. In this episode, we're going to kind of have a rundown of all of our episodes, have a chat about what our thoughts are. So if you're interested in that, please stay and listen. We're going to try to keep it short, but as usual, things will inevitably run over time.
Mm-hmm.
So without further ado,
let's get into it. Okay, Brendan, so this is the last episode.
Yeah.
And looking back, which one did you enjoy most recording, editing, or maybe even producing?
I mean, I think maybe the one that stands out first is the recent one, the decentering perspective. Because one, it was easy to edit. That one was fire to edit. It was super simple. Nerdy part aside, but since we're on that episode, I think it was a really cool step outside of Europe. I think that was a good place to end. And it was nice to have Gergana and Assam on talking about the research that they did together. And that was nice. And I think it also was a culmination of our style on this podcast, that they talked about the research and then we talked about broader ideas and aspects of understanding Europe, understanding how the world works in our limited capacity. Because I like foreign policy, and I think the European approach to foreign policy with the European neighborhoods, it's like a euphemistic way of saying spheres of influence, in my opinion, often. Like the European neighborhood policy. You mean our sphere of influence? Yeah. Which in many ways is very 20th century, or even 19th century. But I did enjoy that episode quite a bit because it put it into a different perspective, and I liked the idea of looking at societal opinions rather than elite opinions. I think elite opinions matter a lot because a lot of the decisions are made by elites. It's just the facts of life. But I thought that was really, really cool.
Yeah, that was an interesting episode. I honestly like the fact that we were looking, in other episodes, we were looking at what the European Union is doing or and understanding how it functions. But in this episode, we kind of looked back, okay, so how is the EU perceived in what it is doing, actually?
Yeah.
So I like that perspective. We were no longer looking internally outwards, but we were looking out like from the outside internally. So that was like an inverted perspective, and that was a nice ending episode, I think.
Yeah.
But still, I think for as an arts and culture student, I think the one with Alina CERiM on identity and memory was a very nice episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last few, so the last two actually, we went much more arts and culture.
We did
on memory, and I mean, I find memory fascinating, especially societal, right? So how we collectively remember events that we didn't live through is a really weird part of life and a strong identity former. Like you and I and everyone else we know have these kind of memories, have these memories that are given to us by media, by other people. And it was really interesting to kind of dissect some of those in a European view, right? So what I think a lot of them also have to do with the Second World War and like basically the crimes against humanity that happened then. That's a big former of European identity, at least in these memory things. And that was a really cool episode. Yeah, I agree. That was really fascinating.
I think also it was a really nice opening to the last episode we did, because we were looking in episode 8 on memory and identity. We were looking at how the European identity is shaped by the internal memory, mainly surrounding the World War II events. But if you look at the last episode, a decentered perspective, you actually understand how the way the memory of the EU in non-EU geographies also play into the way the EU is perceived and accepted.
And not even like the EU itself, but mostly Western Europe. I think that was a cool distinction between the South and the Eastern neighborhood.
Yes.
Was kind of this view of Western Europe being basically the colonial powers of Europe. They are the ones that have produced the memories of Europe in other places.
Exactly.
So, you know, if you're from Algeria, you'll think of Europe as basically France plus, rather than this weird thing of European Union. Like, I'm not saying that's what it is, but this kind of idea, right?
But exactly, the history that forms the memory, maybe, if it's the right way to put it, the history that forms the memory in a certain post-colonial geography also constructs the way you see the EU and how you define the EU, and thus how, if you accept its political values and ideologies, right?
It forms how you view those. It doesn't matter like what the outcome is, but it definitely forms them.
Yeah, if it's positively or negatively or not at all, it formed them. So I think that was an interesting way to understand it even more when we went into the decentered perspective.
And it happens again if you look at the Eastern perspective, right? So people there have a collective memory that, you know, views often, you know, in places like Poland or Ukraine, that view Russia as basically a colonial power and the EU as an escape from that, right? So, you know, how true this is up to, you know, historians, not my problem, but the lived experience that people internalize this and view the world this way, it does affect the way we then proceed to interact. And yeah, that was fascinating. And yeah, I agree. I think those two work very well together.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, I didn't think about it that way, but it really does work. Another two that work well together were our third episode and our 7th episode, which were digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy, or open strategic autonomy. Right? I think those were pretty cool. Those were much more internal focus of how the EU likes to views itself and its positions itself. We go from a kind of a view of, how do we see the EU, to how does the EU and the people making decisions in the EU view its kind of path. Strategic autonomy was really, really that one. So seeing how there was this idea that European countries are dependent on other countries. And the problem is not dependency necessarily, but over-dependency on one, right? And the example that was given was Russia and natural resources like energy. And this was just one of many examples. And I think another one is America and security reliance on NATO. Yeah, NATO is important to the European security structure, but should that be more of, should the Europeans carry more of their weight and be more autonomous than if they have the ability to, you know, have pursue their strategic priorities on their own, rather than having to wait for America to say yeah or no. Yeah. So basically, the long and short of strategic autonomy was that the European Union, but also the countries within the EU, can pursue strategic goals with their own capacities, and they don't have to rely overly on another one. And the idea of open strategic autonomy was kind of this weird compromise that, you know, on the one hand, yeah, you want to be able to make your own decisions, but you don't want to become some sort of autarky that isolates itself, right? And you want to still have the benefits of an open system, which the EU, values. It's a liberal democracy, and it values these open systems. Whatever judgment you want to make about that is that, but it internalizes this value. I think that's what's important.
How do you see it connecting to digital sovereignty, though?
Well, it's again this idea that the EU, unlike its major economic competitors, which are the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, they do not have major tech companies, with the exception of Spotify. And I think that's it. I can't think of another major tech company. Yes, Europe and the EU is very important in chip manufacturing. For example, the ASML, this Dutch company, basically had a monopoly on the machines that make the chips, right? So, and Germany is a massive producer of the chemicals we need to make the chips. So Europe has, through years of economic integration, become very important in all these supply chains of making what we need to have tech, right?
So their digital sovereignty would also be part of their open strategic autonomy strategy, no?
Exactly, right? So they kind of, they link together.
Yeah.
Also, that episode was really cool for me because I interviewed Vestager, and I'm gonna be proud of that for a while now. So I'm pretty chuffed. That was a cool interview because then we got it straight from the source, right? So she was then able to explain that, there is this idea of, we want to stay open, and we want to be in a position, the EU, where we can regulate tech, or we can regulate the digital space. So not only the internet and cyberspace, but also the hardware that goes into making that work. That the EU has a say in the system. That it isn't dependent on China, it isn't dependent on the USA, who are all the rule makers. The EU likes its position as a global rule maker. Maybe it's a colonial heritage, but it enjoys this and it uses it to great effect, right?
I agree.
I remember talking to someone once about how the EU kind of creates judicial legitimacy in places it doesn't have it. So it'll go and say, oh, I can regulate that because I can. Why? Because I'm a massive market. What else are you going to do? And, if this is morally right or not, it is something the EU does. And I think they want to keep that position in the digital space and in the rest of, world affairs. But I think these two match really well, especially the idea of open strategic autonomy with what Vestager said, kind of the bridging of the values. Like, do you want, also what Marielle Weimas, the expert we talked to, she said, like, yes, on the one hand, we want to regulate the internet space, but we don't want to create a closed information system. We want it to be open and free, but how do you make that line, right? Do you want to have control, but you also want to be open? That's the difficulty. And I think that's the line that they're trying to walk in all of this. And that's why I think these two work very well together.
They were very interesting episodes, like standalone episodes, but also they do complement each other in some ways. But I genuinely enjoyed the digital sovereignty episode. I think also when we talked about specific countries and specific cases and situations, how do you create in the EU while member states have different levels maybe of digital advancement? So how do you create an equal access or an equal regulation system among member states or across the EU, while different member states have different definitions of how to regulate culturally the digital space, from freedom of expression, from political ideologies or whatever. So I really enjoyed the societal perspective in the digital sovereignty episode. You can tell you're from European studies and I'm from arts and culture.
Yeah. I think it's true, but I think that's also what has made it interesting for both of us when exploring this, and has been an important part, because we are able to explore different aspects of the same questions. Yeah, and I think that's the benefit also of CERiM and of UM is this kind of interdisciplinary
True.
kind of approach.
An episode that I did not expect to enjoy was the World Trade Organization episode.
It was an excellent one.
It was
that was really fun.
Yes, I finally understood how the World Trade Organization works.
Yeah.
It was interesting, honestly. But yeah, I think also what I like about the World Trade Organization episode and strategic autonomy episode is that it grounds it in a more topical, like to actually understand what is happening on real level, like something that is happening now. So I think I remember in the episode of World Trade Organization, we were talking about emerging markets being pressured to identify themselves as
developed basically, yeah.
developed
so developing
economies.
going to developed.
Exactly, from developing to developed. So I think it was putting into perspective what is happening now.
I think you're right. Another point is it meshes well with other episodes, right? Strategic autonomy, but also decentered perspective, because we looked at the research that was done by Kleiner Weinhardt, and it focused on the perspectives and the strategies of these markets that were kind of being pushed by developed markets or developed economies to change the way they identify so that they don't get certain benefits anymore, right? And it kind of compared non-European perspectives on it, right? So the Chinese, I think it was the Chinese, Brazilian, and the Indian perspectives.
Yes. Yep.
And yeah, that was fascinating. Really, really interesting. A lot of these episodes have common themes. And one of the ones that kept coming up was this multipolarity, the world order changing from basically American or Western hegemony led by America, where there's multiple centers of power around the world. And the WTO was one of those, right? So you're showing how these, massive emerging markets are now not only gaining more influence, but also, being asked to change because they're viewed as no longer developing, right? But I mean, you can also say that this is just a way of preserving, I think it was even said in the episode, a way of preserving market dominance by developed markets, that you're like, even though you aren't fully developed, I want you to change the way you are regulated so that I still have that edge over you, right? That's,
Yeah, and it was really interesting. I think if you also look at the strategic autonomy, it's within the change of balance, and the strategic autonomy episode explains how the EU is moving in that realm. So now the EU is like, maybe we should disentangle from the US and its decisions and its wars and start to make our own. And it's this change, this shift in global powers, and I think they tie together because you're looking at different realms or different dimensions of what is happening right now, and then you're seeing the main theme is looking at the EU, how is it functioning in those. So I think it was a nice overview of how the EU is making sense of what is happening in the world right now as an institution, of course, and how is it handling the external and internal changes.
And I think another kind of maybe a bit of a counterpoint to that was the Ukraine episode. So it was 1 year since Ukraine. We were joined by Giselle Bosse, who focused on European external affairs, and we were joined by Ana Herranz-Surales, who was focused more on the energy side of it. But what we did find in that episode was, on the one hand, we talked about Ukraine and what's kind of happening, what the situation is, humanitarian, also energy-wise at the time, how there was systematic destruction of energy infrastructure, and this created problems not only in Ukraine but also in the EU, and how the sanctions affected all this. And that comes to like another point, like this whole the narrative of like, oh, the EU and European countries kind of distancing themselves from the US is kind of flipped on its head when you look at what happened now as the outcome of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where there has been a tighter coordination within NATO, which most EU member states are also NATO member states. Some exceptions like Austria or Ireland.
But wasn't that also in the strategic autonomy episode where we, I think Sophie von Honecker said that because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, some member states were advocating more now for the strategic autonomy strategy. And more countries were like, but this is exactly why we need the US. So it also crystallized this division between member states, with, on the one hand, wanting to be disentangled from the US, but on the other being like, but this is exactly why we need to stay in close cooperation with the US. So I think it's nice to see that the line that the EU is trying to navigate, while its member states do not agree on the strategy that it should be doing or following. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think it shows also 2 points that, again, 2 of these themes that come up again and again. One being that the EU is made up of member states who don't all agree. And most of the time, they don't agree. And I think in what you just said, like Poland, for example, is much more tight with the Americans in terms of security and in their view of how transatlantic security should look like, how global security should look like. While France has always been kind of the special snowflake in Europe, being like, no, we should have our complete autonomy. And these 2 things compete, but they also kind of soften each other. And there is some sort of compromise that does end up happening. And usually it's messy and dirty and takes forever. And I think that's another part of European governance that we've also seen. Like it's slow and deliberative and has a lot of these different things. And then the other one is, because of this, it walks fine lines and it has to walk tightropes between competing, realities that make it really hard to govern. You know, you've got 2 extreme differences of being open and closed, sovereign and cooperative, and it's difficult.
Yeah, I think this also ties the Ukraine episode to the Forged in Crisis episode. It was interesting to see how the EU functions within a crisis state and a non-crisis state. At the same time, the Ukraine episode links well with the identity and memory episode, when I think at the end of the episode, Giselle Bossa was also pointing out the tapping into European identity to be like, this is why we need to help Ukraine.
Yeah, it drew on its narrative memory, right? It drew on the ideas they had in mind about how this conflict has looked like since 2014, how people remember the annexation of Crimea, all of those things. And I think definitely those 2 link.
I think we did a good job
in
this season.
We can pat ourselves on the back. I do think that the Forge in Crisis one had the best name. I think that was the sweetest one. Also because I think it does show that, on the other hand, yes, it's a slow deliberative process, but in the narrative of the EU, and if you look at in the last 2 decades, a lot of major change has happened in these crises. And that, Europe is created in moments of crisis. Yeah. And I think that episode, we looked at both how decisions are made in crises, but also how they're done in the EU and the problems that come with it, but also the massive change that can come with it. And the issues with looking at how those decisions are made, who's in the room when it happens.
And how to define a crisis in the first place.
What a crisis is,
exactly,
right? Because if everything crisis, what is a crisis?
Exactly, yeah. I specifically like the point where we tapped into the social element of crisis and the social media layer within identifying when a crisis is happening, or defining a crisis that would lead to a policy to manage this crisis. Also sometimes comes from the public pressure to be like, this is a crisis and we need to solve it. And we looked at the migration crisis, or I think we mainly looked at the migration crisis.
Also COVID.
Oh, true.
I think we compared both of those quite
exactly.
effectively.
Yeah. So if the general public this is a crisis, but the people who are responsible to respond to crisis do not see it as a crisis, then how does the social interact with the policy making?
And then the other way around too, right? So if decision makers see it as a crisis, but then average people don't, then that probably also has conflict. And the other thing is, in general, another crisis that graces our presence every day is the climate crisis and the inevitable, slow moving crisis that it is.
Arguably slow. I wouldn't say it's slow.
It's slow in terms of
responding to the crisis is slow.
even though the crisis may or may not be slow moving, the EU's slow moving mechanisms have started to address it. So
I love how you put it. Okay.
And we did, I think, our second episode, our first real content episode was about this, about what the just transition means, what that term means, which in short is because climate change is inevitable, because we have to inevitably adapt to this and change our way of life, people's lives will be affected. And a just transition is in general the idea of making that as fair as possible. Right?
Leaving no one behind.
Trying not to leave
motto?
anyone behind, yeah.
And it was mainly around labor, right? Because green jobs and green technology is gonna be a must at this point. So how do you ensure that the people who had, what was it called, brown jobs?
Yeah, I think they did it to brown and green, which basically means carbon neutral and carbon.
Yeah, exactly. So basically the people who were making a living from brown jobs, how do you make this transition just for them? You know? And
how do you make it work for people who've been working, a manufacturing job that is very dirty in terms of carbon intensity? How can you retrain them to, I don't know, make windmills? Or I'm not an expert.
We're not the experts,
so,
but we're,
if you want to hear the experts, they were talking there. But how does that work? And then also, how do you help people who are affected who aren't necessarily working? And how do you affect, in a global perspective, there's places on Earth that will be hit harder. How can that also be part of it? And because the EU is not completely a benevolent actor, we also saw some criticism in this whole system, because you can view it as protectionist. You can view it as a way of saying, hey, the EU, we are going to change our way of production. We're going to make things greener. And because our industry is doing that, we're going to put a tax on carbon, and anything that comes from outside is going to have to face taxes. So, oh no, we're more competitive now. Oh, damn it. Oh, wish that didn't happen. So I think this is also not gone unnoticed in the world. There are a lot of criticisms of this, especially coming out of India and other developing countries, where they see this as basically protectionism. So climate protectionism. And that comes out of things like CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which was also involved in the just transition. And the just transition being part of a bunch of different EU packages, like the Fit for 55 or Green New Deal, which is kind of the overarching agenda. All of these things together, they are not done in a vacuum, right? And I think, again, one of the themes of this podcast is that the EU is not just a Eurocentric one monolith, but a actor in a global world where its actions are hefty and affect everyone on Earth. But yeah, I think we've covered all the content episodes. That leaves us with our last one, which was the first one. The introduction to
CERiM.
exactly.
Yeah, if we need to reiterate, this podcast series was a collaboration between the Center for European Research in Maastricht, CERiM, and the Maastricht Diplomat, the student association as a part of United Nations Student Association, UNSA. So naturally, we started with the first episode about understanding what CERiM does and what it is as a research institution, but also as a place to look for interdisciplinary ways to understand and conceptualize the EU and its policy and its history and so on and so forth. Yeah,
and I think we've tried. I remember Charelle and I, we've had conversations about what we've learned. And do we understand Europe? And I think the short answer is no.
No. I do have to say, as a person who comes from arts and culture, a Middle Eastern, this series has been very informative for me. I don't understand completely the EU. And I think it's going to be an ever-changing entity, It's going to keep on changing and keep on redefining its strategies and ideologies and so on and so forth. But I think what I have understood is that the constant in the EU strategy is the flexibility that it has. And flexibility has to always reap benefits for itself. And I mean, it's a fair strategy. I think all powers, global powers, do the same. You always want to feed your own economy. You always want to be on top, whatever. But I think that is the only thing that I understood.
I think you should get an honorary degree in European studies at this point.
Passos, do you hear this? I need a minor in European studies.
But yeah, I hope also as the listeners you manage to glean some understanding of these episodes. And I think it wouldn't be a Understanding Europe episode if we didn't do secondary sources.
Mm-hmm.
So out of all of the secondary sources, do you have a favorite, Charelle?
Oof.
Or one that really marked you?
Oh my God. I think the one I enjoyed the most doing and researching and recording was the Identity and Memory episode with Alina CERiM. I think it also because it aligns well with what I study, and I really love the social aspect and how things move on a lot, like the microphysics of things, and before they even reach the legislation or they reach the hegemonic narrative to navigate people's lives. How does it actually form from a person to person? So I really love that episode for that. But I think the episode that taught me a lot was the Open Strategic Autonomy. So I think I would recommend these two. So
you're recommending our own podcasts as your secondary sources?
Yes.
I respect that. That's hustle right there.
I mean, shamelessly, self-promoting.
Absolutely shamelessly. I know. You know what? That's what we're supposed to do. And yeah, I think that's a good choice. I second your opinion.
Thank you. I mean, if you have to recommend something outside, something that aligns with what we are doing, I think I will also recommend something that aligns with Identity and Memory episode, and that would be Post-Memory Theory of Marianne Hirsch. I think that aligns really well with the Identity and Memory episode. It's a very interesting, and I think it is open access for FASO students or for students in general, because it is something that has been taught in one of the arts and culture bachelor courses. So I think that theory, or that the book on that theory, is also available through the library for students.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, very cool.
What about you?
I think I'm going to try to dip into one of our episodes and choose a secondary source that they had there. And that would be surprisingly from the WTO one, which doesn't sound like the sexiest episode, but it was a fascinating episode. And props to Clara Weinhardt for really explaining her research clearly, but also to a project that she plugged, that she worked on, which basically took a human lens on the WTO. And I found that fascinating, because we do think about all these institutions, like, for example, the EU or the WTO or whatever, and we see monoliths, we see kind of creatures of bureaucracy. We don't see that those bureaucrats are people. And this really highlighted the people who were there, and I found that really cool and refreshing. I think that one jumps out of me as one of the ones I'd really recommend. I think between you and me, that's already 5 things to look at, so I think I'll only add that. Also, I think I've been talking the whole time. I hope you guys enjoyed our ramblings, but I think this brings us to the end of the episode, the end of this academic year, 2022 to 2023. Hopefully we'll see you, or you'll hear us again next academic year. Thank you for listening. Pay attention to this space and CERiM's social media for any updates on this podcast.
Yeah, it was fun. I learned a lot. I hope you guys also learned something, specifically for my arts and culture fellows. But yeah, stay tuned for season 2, hopefully. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon. The music for the MD podcast episode has been produced by Stone Ocean. And this podcast episode has been produced, recorded, and edited by Brendan Hogan and yours truly, Charelle Abdullah. Talk to you soon.